love of horror fiction for as long as I can remember, having picked up Stephen King novels at far too young an age. The works of Poe and Lovecraft and their supernatural and eldritch terrors have always fascinated me. This short piece is inspired by their works. The wind gusted, whispering its raspy voice through the naked branches of the old oak tree, keeping a silent watch in the garden. A crow ruffled its feathers against the biting gale from its lofty perch. A chill rain tapped out an unsteady rhythm on the window pane of the crumbling house, barely lit by the sputtering flame of a few oil lamps. The solitary crow let out a mournful caw in the dead of night. It sat sentinel, looking over the darkened house. Only the faintest pale yellow glow flickered from the rain-slicked upstairs window. The dim room was frigid, a bitter draught finding its way in through the dilapidated window frame of the old house. Sheets of discarded paper, torn to pieces or scrunched into balls, littered the warped floorboards. The detritus of a troubled mind filled the untidy room. The house had fallen into the depths of neglect this past year. Without the steadying influence of his beloved wife, he had descended into the worlds created by his imagination. So much so, he lived there, seldom returning to the real world anymore. The bleak room had become his refuge from the world outside, a sanctuary from the grief that filled his heart and the madness that threatened to consume him. Self-care was all but non-existent. Out of pity, the elderly housekeeper visited once a day, even though she no longer received payment for her work. She knew he wouldn't feed himself otherwise, and out of a misguided sense of duty, she couldn't in all good faith let that be. She left a tray of food, good home-cooked sustenance, outside the door. The only sound she ever heard from beyond the threshold was the fevered clacking of a typewriter under sustained attack. By morning, the tray would be back where it had been left, a mess of half-finished morsels of food that had been pushed around the plate, and the sporadic staccato of the typewriter. It seemed he no longer slept. With his state of mind, he likely deemed that he no longer had need of such trivialities. At a battered, scarred old desk, once a magnificent testament to a skilled carpenter, a haggard-looking figure sat hunched over an aging typewriter. Less than pristine sheets of paper lay scattered around the desk, notes scrawled all over in smudged ink. Crossings out abound. A pen lay discarded precariously close to the edge of the desk. The slightest contact would send it crashing to the floor. An upended inkwell dripped its midnight black contents onto the floor. The tortured figure of a man sat in clothes, stained and tarnished with who knew what, muttering to himself. Incoherent, almost mumbling in tongues. His grip on his own sanity, something of a long-distant past. The tormented writer had not seen the world beyond his room in a year. The room where he had held his wife as she slipped beyond this life had become his prison. A prison of grief, a prison of delirium. Something consumed him. Writing was all he could do. And write, he did. Day and night, time became an alien concept with no meaning to him. If you asked him, in a rare moment of lucidity, he could not answer what day it was, or the year, or when he had last slept soundly. Every moment became fitful, tormented within his own mind. And that torment bled out into his work in ink. Increasingly, disturbing visions plagued his mind. And these torturous manifestations of a broken mind infested his creations. Bleak worlds filled with nothing more than strife, tragedy, and horror. The anguish and fear He felt manifested in his work, creatures that even the most tortured soul would cower in fear at the sight of. Eldritch gods, horrific apparitions, beings that stalked the shadows and preyed upon the fears of mankind in the darkest corners of the mind. The anguish, the desolation, the grief spilled from him like blood from a wound. Black and rotten, a torrent of emotion in prose, filled page after page. Days flew past, the pages of the calendar turning over in a flash. Seasons came and went. The hope of spring as color returns to the world. The warmth of summer and its expansive cobalt skies smudged with gossamer thin clouds. The crunch of grass after the first autumn frost and the riot of orange in the trees. The cold bleakness of winter, skeletal trees reaching up to grey skies, beseeching the clouds to cover the land with a blanket of frigid snow. And yet still, he remained. Day after day, he sat solemnly before his typewriter, hammering the keys. The clacking of the strike bars, the chime and ratcheting of the carriage return filled the dank room. Over many months, this process continued. His clothes became dirtier, his appearance more disheveled. His face became ever more gaunt. Blue eyes, once vibrant and icy, now looked grey and sunken into deep shadowed sockets. Cheekbones protruded from paper-thin flesh. Ribs, once hidden by the comfort of a happy, loving life, now showed like a skeletal xylophone beneath his loose-fitting, tatty shirt. His writing, once his passion, now became his nightmare, his obsession, his addiction. It consumed his every waking moment and the few brief hours he spent asleep. It consumed his physical being too. As winter gripped the world in its icy grasp, the man had descended into madness, delirious and incapable of anything more than writing. Sleep was an old friend, long since departed, and food no longer passed his lips. In the bitter cold of the old decaying house he wrote onwards, the blackened, frost-bitten fingers clumsily striking the keys of his worn typewriter. His progress slowed as his mind faltered, the words appearing on the page less frequently. Deep inside his tortured mind, he knew he was close to the end of his magnum opus, the end of his time on earth, tired, so painfully weary. Each blink lasted longer as his mind and body slowly shut down. Just to rest his eyes for a moment, the glorious bliss of slumber. But he mustn't. To even entertain it would spell disaster and assure his failure to finish his work. For this piece would be his legacy in the world, that which he would be immortalized for. As he slowly forged onwards, shadows deepened, taking on substance around him. They coalesced as the frigid room filled with sound. The susurration of 1,000 or more eldritch voices spoke in the words of the ancients. The lost languages filled the room, swirling and twisting and roiling like a gale tossing paper, discarded clothing and detritus about the space. A fiery red glow, dim to begin with, glowed about the haggard writer as he pushed on to the end. Growing brighter with every agonizing, labored keystroke, the dark shadows coalesced in the ominous light. Wispy and indistinct to begin with, they grew more solid, more whole. Their indecipherable words rose to a dread screeching that seemed to echo out across the land. A crescendo of horror barely held back. A primal part of his brain sensed the end was at hand, and with a final flurry of frenzied typing, the writer slumped back in his chair. The howling shriek stopped as the myriad shadow beings swirled like a murmuration of starlings, smashing through the dirty glass window and out into the stormy night. All except one. It stumbled in a stuttering gait, It stood tall, with unnaturally long limbs, broad shoulders, and black leather skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its mouth, a wide slit in its vast head filled with sharp teeth, slathered a putrescent black ooze. Looming over the rider as he dragged ragged final breaths into his failing lungs, it grabbed him by the throat with gnarled fingers. It lifted him up, glowing yellow eyes staring deep within the soul of the broken man. A deep voice echoed in his mind, though no words were spoken. You gave us life. We fed upon your grief and fear, as we shall on that of all mankind. You opened the door between this world and the beyond. Now we shall give you your legacy. The creature squeezed its hand around his neck, snapping it like dry kindling, then dropped the writer to the floor, like nothing more consequential than the myriad discarded pieces of paper littering the ground. Unfurling leathery wings, it took flight into the glowing red sky through the broken window. Screams rose from the town below as it swooped off to feast for eternity on fear and terror. The writer gazed with dying eyes out at the destruction he had created, then breathed no more. The crow, still perched in its tree, ruffled its feathers against the growing storm. With a solitary, mournful caw, it took flight into the raging sky.